Lithe, graceful, and deadly, the pterodactyl was one of the first known reptiles that evolved powered flight. Its wing movements held within them a beautiful science that would live on long after the end of the prehistoric world. But out of the remnants of that distant past, one 20th century inventor created a method of flight that would change aviation's future. In the designs of Geoffrey Hill, the swept-wing tailless plane would not fly as a machine, but in the same style as a living animal. And the pterodactyl would find life again in a new man-made body, but would soar above the earth just as it always had. The dust had barely settled from the Second World War when Allied forces started to exploit the treasure trove of aerodynamic data collected by the defeated Luftwaffe and its various manufacturers. Britain too followed suit in sharing the spoils of war. Many German aviation concepts were seriously considered and, in fact, ultimately employed. At the same time, the British government could sense the onslaught of the Cold War and wanted to be ready in case tensions between the US and the Soviet Union suddenly turned hot. The nation was deeply in debt, but homeland security was still given top priority, which is why the British Ministry of Supply issued an order for a new bomber. History would later call this order the V-bomber specification. The government was looking for a long-range aircraft that would employ the jet power technology discovered but not used to its full capacity during the war. Coupled with the aerodynamic marvels developed by the Germans, Britain was determined not to be caught off guard in the event of a nuclear conflict. The Americans had already shown the might of their atom bomb at the end of the war, while the Soviets got a jump start on their own program by exploiting German nuclear resources.
The best recent study by David Holloway on Stalin and the bomb has come to the conclusion that the Soviets were really disappointed at the sort of technological level of the German nuclear program, and that the chief gain for them was not the sort of technological know-how of the German scientists, but the uranium, the processed uranium that they managed to get their hands on, which in Holloway's estimation probably saved the Soviet nuclear bomb project about a year.
Britain was developing its own bomb program and felt the first things it needed were bomber aircraft advanced enough to carry the load. 4 submissions from 4 different British manufacturers were ordered to go into production. 3 of the planes employed technology that was borrowed from newly accessible German research. Because of them, history would look back on this era as the golden age of British bombers, where grace, beauty, power and efficiency were all ingredients used to produce the majestic aircraft of Britain's V-bomber force: the Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, and the Handley Page Victor. Of these 3 bombers, the Valiant had the least sophisticated design, but was the first to see flight time, with a prototype taking off in 1951. This was a conservative but cleanly built aircraft and could accommodate a 10,000-pound bomb. In fact, the very first British atomic weapon, a live Blue Danube, was dropped during a 1956 test in Australia using the Valiant B-1. Despite being the least advanced of the V-bombers, the Valiant was the first to fulfill the purpose for which it was built. In contrast, the Avro Vulcan was a sleek subsonic bomber and sported a unique delta wing configuration that set it apart. Its wingtip rudders gave it control, even while carrying 21,000 pounds worth of bombs. Of all the V-bombers, the Victor was regarded as the most futuristic and avant-garde in both looks and performance. Because it was specifically designed to quickly invade Soviet airspace, it could fly higher and faster than any of its contemporaries. Despite the defense capabilities these 3 planes gave Britain, it was interesting that none of them was 100% British. Each had its origins in the seized German research. There was, however, the fourth V-bomber submission that the government rejected as being too ambitious. It was the Short brothers PD-1, a medium-range bomber design that had very little to do with seized German technology and more with a single flying wing. To help create this advanced aircraft, the Shorts team recruited an engineer who was famed for his work in tailless plane design, Professor Geoffrey T. Hill. Despite Hill's involvement, the PD-1 never made it past the design stage. But it did later take on other forms and names before claiming its place in the books as the Shorts Sherpa, a highly developed unit that sported a unique swept-back wing design that Hill specifically created for this project. The fact that both the Sherpa and the PD-1 had their roots in wholly British research made it ironic that the Ministry of Supply declined to produce the PD-1. This research began a full generation before the other V-bombers were even drawn up. In fact, it was spearheaded by Hill in the 1920s as a series of tailless planes called Pterodactyls, aircraft designed for superior flight safety and control. But in spite of Hill's achievements as a pioneer of swept-wing, tailless flight, and in spite of his role in the development of the PD-1 and the Sherpa, he was ultimately disregarded by the aviation community towards the end of his career in the 1950s.
At that time, he might well have been a forgotten man, inasmuch as none of his designs had been taken up. But I think that's only part of the story.
As far as I know, in the later part of his life, he was desperately disappointed that all of the work and the really brilliant and inventive work that he had done had not really apparently got real tangible results, although there were aeroplanes coming out of Short brothers that were important.
Hill believed that a swept-wing, tailless aircraft represented a more natural method of flight. But he wasn't the one who started the movement. It all began in the early 1900s with a pilot and designer named John William Dunn, whose work greatly influenced Hill. Dunn's goal was to develop a flying machine that required no steering. He designed aircraft for Britain that always bore the distinctive V shape of an arrowhead, later to be known as swept wings. The original Dunn biplane was such an achievement that almost a full century later, a Canadian mechanical engineer named Barry McKerracher built a full-sized replica of a later version called the Burgess Dunn. Now permanently on display at the Royal Canadian Air Force Museum in Trenton, the plane is the spitting image of the 1914 Burgess Dunn, from the pilot's seat to the copper gas tanks to the airframe. But the plane's swept wings were its most revolutionary feature.
This particular airplane would not fall or stall. As it lowered its airspeed, it actually dipped the nose down, picked up speed, and then came back up again. It didn't fall off to either wing, which is some things that happen to straight normal biplanes or wings.
The idea would change conventional aviation, but Dunn had a hard time proving it. Almost a decade and 4 limited prototypes later, the military had had enough of Dunn's seemingly quirky planes. Spurred on by financial support from his friends, he built and successfully flew the Dunn D5 tailless biplane. Dunn soon built more prototypes, including the smooth and stable D8, which is what caught the eye of an American boat and aircraft builder named Starling Burgess. After Burgess bought the US manufacturing rights, the Burgess-Dunn biplane began its development. Its full wingspan was 47 feet, but the fuselage itself was only 26 feet long. There were 2 seats up top for the pilot and navigator, with the seat in front guaranteeing a particularly thrilling ride. There was absolutely nothing in front of the pilot except his own feet. The seaplane was about 11.5 feet tall and rested on a large float on bottom. making the whole fuselage look something like two canoes connected with piano wire and wooden planks. The aircraft was designed with control and handling components to add to its inherent stability. This was so the plane would appeal to military buyers, as it did to the Canadian government. During the First World War, the Burgess Dunn became the first military plane Canada ever purchased. But a rocky delivery prevented it from ever getting airborne.
They got to Quebec City. They didn't have time to take the airplane apart. So they put the airplane on the top of the deck and tied it down so tightly that it wouldn't move. Well, if you get in a rolling sea, things had better move or they're going to be in. And it's exactly what happened at about, I'd say, 100 miles out or on a rough sea, and the airplane just broke up.
Nevertheless, the plane's purchase was a triumph of epic proportions for John W. Dunn, who was once believed to be a failure, but will forever be remembered as the creator of the very first swept-wing tailless aircraft. While Dunn's journey of producing his plane was finally coming to fruition during World War I, Geoffrey Hill's journey in the aviation industry was just beginning. While on his honeymoon at the end of the war, he happened to look out onto a pond nearby at seagulls on the water. He couldn't help but notice how the birds could achieve a variety of gliding positions without ever losing control of their wings or flight path. Wouldn't it be ideal, he thought, if an aircraft's wings could adjust to the airflow around it, just like the wings of a bird? He soon got the chance to put his newfound inspiration to the test, and, fittingly enough, it took on the name of a prehistoric bird, the pterodactyl. After a brief stint working as a test pilot, Hill won a 3-year research scholarship, which gave him free rein to develop his ideas. Living just outside Farnborough at that time, he spent his days outside building his very first prototype by hand. His wife, May, also helped out by stitching canvas for the wings and lending her husband a hand when he needed it. One day in 1923, the president of the Royal Aeronautical Society, Colonel Alec Ogilvie, dropped by with a financial vote of confidence for the struggling engineer.
And he came and sat in the kitchen, and he said to Geoffrey, "How are you off for money?" And Geoffrey said, "Pretty short. It's getting pretty short, sir." So Colonel Ogilvie reached in his pocket and produced a £50 note, and that was big money in those days. And he said, "Will this help?" "It certainly will, sir," my father replied. Colonel Ogilvie said, let me know how you get on, because I want to come and watch you fly it." And Geoffrey said, "Well, there are plenty of other people who might like to fly it." And Colonel Ogilvie said they're all absolutely scared stiff that they're going to be chosen to fly it, and they're unhappy about whether it will fly or not. So Geoffrey said, "Well, we'll see, and I'm prepared to be the first to fly." So that was really the story of the Pterodactyl Mark I.
Hill stayed true to his word to be the first to fly the aircraft. He first got it airborne on New Year's Eve of 1924 and tested it again several times throughout the following year. It was soon ready for the King's Cup Air Show, where the unusual creation caught the eye of both the King and Queen. They thought it was curious that the aircraft looked so much like a bird, and were even more interested to see how it flew. And they weren't the only ones who were impressed when it took to the air. The head of Westland Aircraft at that time was Sir Ernest Petter, who didn't just notice the pterodactyl because it was oddly shaped, but because it was the one plane in the show with no tail. In almost no time, Hill was named Westland's tailless aircraft designer, and the family moved into a house in Yeovil, which would be their home for the next 8 years. Hill's home away from home would be the Westland facilities, where he was immediately put to work on the Westland Hill Pterodactyl I-A. It was a two-seater monoplane with a greatly streamlined design and a 75 horsepower engine tucked in the back. Over the course of 1926 alone, this aircraft made 21 test flights and could reach a maximum speed of 70 miles an hour. Despite his flying experience, Hill was told by Westland to stay out of the cockpit and instead get back to the drawing board to devise a new and improved Pterodactyl II, which was designed as a pusher biplane. All of Hill's early models sported wingtip controls that were a combination of ailerons and elevators, namely elevons, which were common on several tailless swept-wing planes in that era.
What they call ailerons on this particular airplane are actually elevons, as there is no tail and no elevator, and the ailerons are back behind the fuselage, so they incorporate the two words and call them elevons. The purpose, of course, is to raise or lower the nose of the aircraft or turn right or left.
The pterodactyls did not use surface controls like ailerons in a normal sense. Rather, they would turn at the end of the wing, which was a process known as wing rotation. Only when both wingtips moved in opposite directions did they function as ailerons. When they moved in the same way, they would work as elevators. This was the secret behind the pterodactyl's remarkable stability and control. In the early 30s came the Pterodactyl IV, which was a three-seat cabin monoplane with 120 horsepower and a new tandem wheel undercarriage. This model boasted even better control than its predecessors because it was fitted with vertical rudders instead of the usual horizontal rudders. There was also a new gear installed that made it easy to manually vary the aircraft's wing sweep. While Hill was still planning the Mark V version, the Air Ministry specification for which the pterodactyls were built was cancelled. Hill paid no mind to this small setback and continued designing. But the seemingly small setback would be followed by a much larger one.
Well, what happened was that Sir Ernest Petter appointed his son Teddy, aged 26, to be technical director, and it led to my grandfather and others resigning. Essentially, from my grandfather's point of view, he felt that it was quite impossible to develop an experimental aeroplane with somebody with so little understanding of what he was doing in charge.
Coincidentally, Hill received an offer from University College London of a professorship in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. He took the job, but remained a part-time consultant at Westland as a favour to Sir Ernest Petter. However, this arrangement ended when he learned of the blow Teddy dealt to the pterodactyl project.
It was Teddy Petter who actually wrote to the War Ministry, as I understand it, to suggest that the pterodactyl program should be scrapped, and so it was. And I think that my grandfather, it was a really bitter blow to him. By that time, he'd really devoted anything up to 15 years of thinking about how to design a plane in this way, and I think he must have felt that it had come to nothing.
Teddy Petter wanted the company to go after more lucrative government contracts instead of spending time and money on independent research. That decision may have hurt the pterodactyl, but was a shrewd business move that was ultimately good for Westland. The first specification the company pursued after Teddy took the helm in 1934 was for a military observation plane, which gained notoriety as the legendary Westland Lysander. Now that the pterodactyl's development was abandoned, Hill dedicated himself to teaching at University College London for the rest of the 30s. But he again got the chance to employ his tailless principles on an aircraft when the British government sent him to Canada for 2 years during the Second World War. The Allies did not have the upper hand in battle in 1942, and the UK felt it needed better technology. So the Ministry of Supply assigned Hill to a glider project at the National Research Council in Ottawa, where he designed and tested another tailless aircraft. Informally called the NRC Pterodactyl glider, it clocked about 105 hours in the sky by the end of its testing period, and travelled 2,300 miles, clear across Canada. Although Hill was technically based in Ottawa, his work took him all over the continent. In fact, Hill did a lot more than his official job title suggested, and for employers other than the Canadian government.
He was known as the Senior Scientific Liaison Officer. He was very proud of the title because he said it doesn't mean a thing. So I asked him, what did it involve? And he said, well, I go around the different aircraft manufacturers and help them with their sums. Helping with their sums was really a cover-up, because all the time he was working with Boeings, and they were thinking ahead long after the war. Where do we go to from here?
While working with American manufacturers, Hill met another pioneer in flying wing technology, Jack Northrop, and built a solid rapport with the American aircraft engineer. Focusing on the flying wing was a wise instinct for both men, as the high-wing, tailless monoplane style of aircraft was poised to make a comeback. Although Hill's talents were not always appreciated by the aircraft companies in his native land, the Americans were quite taken with his skills and knowledge. This led to a lucrative offer at the end of the war that would have completely changed Hill's professional life.
My mother suggested that Boeing's wanted him to join them as their chief designer at the end of the war. And certainly I believe there were conversations about that, and he was trying to entice, he would have unlimited travel for him and his family between the UK and Seattle. And of course, had he worked for Boeing's, the world would have been his oyster in terms of his ability to develop ideas. And so inevitably there is a sense, that here was a really remarkable man.
But Hill could not bear to leave Britain for good, even if turning down Boeing was a terrible career move. Upon returning home at the end of the war, Hill was promoted to Dean of the Faculty of Engineering at University College London. By this time, the war was over, but tensions in Europe were still simmering. Germany was still a hotbed for political trouble, and the presence of the Soviet Union in that country did not help the situation. With this in mind, Britain's Ministry of Supply issued requirements in 1947 for an advanced bomber that would protect its interests should the need arise. These requirements for a very complex and cutting-edge aircraft were later known as the V-bomber specification. However, the ministry recognized it would be difficult for most manufacturers to quickly fulfill this need. So it also put out a more simple order for a conservative World War II-style bomber that could carry a heavy load and be built much faster. Short Brothers of Ireland won the bid to make this four-engined aircraft called the SA-4 Sperrin, which looked more like a product of the Second World War than a contender to fly in the Cold War. The ministry thought so too, but only years later, when two prototypes were already in the works. Shorts was formally told that the Sperrin would not go into production, but its prototypes could still be completed and tested. At about the same time that Shorts was drawing up plans for the Sperrin in 1947, it was also readying itself to relocate to better facilities in Belfast. In addition to taking on the Sperrin, the company decided to also bid for the extremely advanced bomber aircraft that the Ministry of Supply initially ordered. This plane would be the technological opposite of the Sperrin in appearance and capabilities. But the company still needed an expert in aeronautics to help guide the process. Hill's principles were quite well known in the aircraft industry, and Shorts felt he was the right man to call for this job. Despite his distinguished position at UCL, he tendered his resignation and made the move to Belfast. He was technically a consulting engineer for Shorts, but oversaw several projects that others were creating. He also worked closely with chief designer David Keith Lucas, who shared Hill's great interest in tailless plane design. The fuselage of the new aircraft would more or less be modelled after the Sperrin, but the rest of the plane would be far more innovative. They proposed a flying wing configuration, so all the controls would be found on the single wing. Curiously enough, the highly swept wing coincided quite closely with German data for aircraft which could only really maximise the feature at high speeds unobtainable without jet power. By this time, jet power was being employed by at least 4 different countries. With the availability of the jet and ready access to high-speed wind tunnels, Short brothers used Hill's basic premise of the pterodactyl, invented almost 30 years previously, to research and design a concept known as the PD-1, a medium-range, high-speed bomber capable of carrying a weight equivalent to those of that era's atomic devices. The wing on this aircraft would still be swept, but would bear differences from the wing that Hill put on the Pterodactyl series several decades before.
Geoffrey called it the isoclinic wing, which meant that you could alter the pitch of the wing at different speeds, that if an aircraft was coming into land, it could have the full use of like a fixed wing, but when it got up high, it could fold it, not completely folded back, but a few degrees, and this would improve the performance enormously.
Short's PD-1 proposal competed with at least 3 other prime contesters, the basically conservative Vickers Valiant, and 2 highly advanced designs, the Avro Vulcan and the Handley Page Victor. Both the Vulcan and the Victor employed German aerodynamic technology, while Short's aircraft was entirely built upon British research of the flying wing. Short's held the title of being the oldest aircraft manufacturer in the world, and was very well respected within government circles and the industry. But on balance, it was ultimately felt that the company's revolutionary design was perhaps a little too revolutionary, and so it was rejected, while the other 3 aircraft went on to form a triad that became Britain's V-bomber force. Not to be deterred, Short brothers continued privately in 1951 with the development of their 1/3 experimental glider model of the PD-1, which was called the SB-1. This glider was the first aircraft that actually featured Geoffrey Hill's aero-isoclinic wing, and was designed to be an inexpensive machine, which was a good thing, because the only prototype crashed after just a few months of testing. Hill and Keith Lucas went back to the drawing board and emerged 6 months later with an aircraft that essentially sported the same design, but now had a lighter fuselage and 2 small turbojets. The rotary wingtip controls remained, as they would provide this new aircraft with greater stability at transonic speeds. This plane was known as the SB-4 Sherpa, a unique design that could trace its ancestry directly back to the pterodactyls of the 1920s. The Sherpa was first flown in 1953 and ushered in a whole new era of flight engineering. But that wasn't all it represented. This test flight brought with it vindication for Geoffrey Hill, who spent a lifetime trying to prove the worth of the tailless plane and the isoclinic wing. This was a lifetime wrought with personal and professional battles to progress a way of aircraft design that was very much ahead of its day. But as far as Hill was concerned, it wasn't at all about personal glory. It was really only about seeing a good idea get recognized.
I think he never personally pushed himself to be recognized. He would never sort of say, what a good boy am I. No, he was very reticent of taking any personal praise. He would take the attitude that gets in the way of progress.
It seemed the very thing Hill had been waiting for was the Sherpa to touch the sky. When it finally did in 1953, he retired. By that time, the once vigorous engineer found his life was slipping into decline, both in terms of his health and the way he was regarded in the aviation industry.
A story that sort of encapsulates this was told by Harold Penrose, again the chief test pilot at Westlands, in I think it was 1954-55, at the Farnborough Air Show. My grandfather always had a drinks party to which he invited all his old friends and so on. And Harold Penrose was running very late for getting there, but eventually got there and was very dismayed to find that there were no cars in the driveway. Anyway, he rang the bell. My grandmother answered it, and he said, "I'm so sorry, I'm late for the drinks party." And she said, "Nobody came, and Geoffrey's gone upstairs to bed, but he'd love to see you." And that was the last time that Harold Penrose saw my grandfather before my grandfather died.
In many ways, it could be said that Hill was a disappointed man when he died in 1955 at the relatively young age of 60. For such a prolific engineer and designer, none of his planes ever made it into production, not even the Sherpa, which was only ever meant to be an experimental aircraft. Moreover, the project he had devoted most of his young life to, the Pterodactyls, was cut short before reaching fruition. But at the same time, Hill's goal was finally realized as the Sherpa first graced the skies in 1953. Although it was never a V-bomber, it proved the performance value and stability of the tailless plane, and truly showed the world the importance of the aero-isocyclic wing. And although Hill was never a celebrated designer, it can't be denied that his work altered the flight path of aviation.
The B-2 Spirit takes the shape of a flying wing, serving as a strategic bomber. Its streamlined and efficient design makes it nearly undetectable by enemy radar. Despite being one of the most sophisticated weapons in America's arsenal, its journey to deployment was nearly jeopardized. Jack Northrop, an aviation legend, conceived the idea of the flying wing, turning his inspiration into an all-consuming obsession. When persistent design issues led the military to discard his prototype as scrap metal, Jack Northrop retired, deeply disheartened. Nevertheless, the vision of the flying wing that he passionately pursued persists. Featuring a striking black wedge shape spanning 172 feet from wingtip to wingtip, the B-2 Spirit resembles a futuristic bird of prey more than any other human-made object in the sky. It boasts an impressive payload capacity of 40,000 pounds, capable of carrying conventional or nuclear weapons to any target worldwide. Its unique ability to attack with pinpoint accuracy while maintaining near invisibility to enemy radar sets it apart. This revolutionary aircraft stands as the latest addition to a lineage of U.S. nuclear intercontinental bombers dating back to the Cold War's inception in the late 1940s. The B-36 Peacemaker, the initial and largest among these planes, was chosen for production over the direct predecessor of the B-2, the YB-49. The narrative of these two aircraft, one colossal and conventional, the other sleek and a flying wing, is steeped in competition, controversy, dreams, and disappointments, reflecting the vision of a pioneering aviator who envisioned the flying wing as the shape of the future. The visionary figure was none other than Jack Northrop. Jack Northrop firmly believed in the principle that if something is both efficient and beautiful, it is right. This philosophy infused a sense of velocity into every aircraft he designed. Commencing his career at Lockheed in 1919, Jack Northrop's passion for creating the perfect airplane led him through pivotal roles at Douglas, Boeing, and eventually his own company.
His peers respected him and considered him one of the design geniuses of American aviation. Donald Douglas mentioned that there's a little bit of Jack Northrop in every American airplane that's been designed.
When you walk around the United States Air Force Museum, you see the little influences of Northrop. You can actually see the imprint of the man's work. We have an A-17, and his name is just stamped all over this aircraft. It's a gorgeous airplane to begin with, and it shows a certain degree of sophistication that some of the other designers weren't quite there yet.
One of Northrop's groundbreaking contributions to aircraft design was the introduction of the all-metal monocoque fuselage. This innovation eliminated the need for drag-inducing wing supports like struts and wires.
We have in our collection a Northrop Alpha, and it was the first monocoque aircraft built by Northrop. It was very unique. It was used for carrying passengers like an airliner, and then later on when what they call a CAA said that we needed multi-engine aircraft for airliners, it was relegated to carrying the mail. All-metal, monocoque structured airplane, very well built.
In the 1920s, Northrop Company played a pivotal role in designing the Spirit of St. Louis for Charles Lindbergh. Additionally, they crafted the first all-metal low-wing fighters for both the Navy and Army Air Corps. Northrop's influence extended to the design of the Lockheed Vega, a highly successful aircraft flown by aviation pioneers Wiley Post and Amelia Earhart in the 1930s. The profits from this venture fueled his ambition to pursue a project he had dreamed of since adolescence, the flying wing. The flying wing concept, ingrained in nature itself, is a timeless design observed in various forms, from birds and sea animals to wind-borne seeds. Some aviation pioneers of the early 20th century were inspired by these examples, designing flying machines that attempted to emulate the wing-like aerodynamic shapes they observed in the natural world. Jack Northrop's fascination with the shapes of nature was deeply rooted in his upbringing in Santa Barbara, California. Observing the graceful soaring of seagulls above the local beaches inspired him to delve into the study of flight. During this time, he began sketching airplane designs, predominantly centered around one large wing. Aligned with the ideas of his predecessors, Northrop envisioned that such an aircraft, characterized by a prominent wing, could be significantly lighter and more efficient than traditional designs.
It's aerodynamically sounder. You don't need a stabilizer. You don't need a tail. You do not need a long fuselage, which all of these increase drag. More drag means you have to have more fuel to fly further distances.
However, the early wing design encountered challenges related to control and stability. Undeterred, Jack Northrop remained enthralled by the potential advantages of the flying wing. From the outset of his career, he committed himself to addressing the drawbacks associated with wing-only designs.
He worked for Lockheed and Douglas before he founded his own company, and of course at lunchtime the engineers would get together and have a little bull session, and they all kind of agreed that the flying wing was the ultimate design.
After conducting experiments with the gliders, Northrop, in 1929, reached a milestone by testing a powered prototype of a flying wing. Due to the uncertainties surrounding the aerodynamic stability of a pure flying wing, this design incorporated some features reminiscent of a conventional aircraft.
It did have twin-tail booms with a conventional tail in the back. He was trying to get the best lift coefficients on the wing roots and airfoils, and he learned a lot from that.
In the fall of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Northrop formed his own company, Northrop Aircraft, and began producing new aircraft and bombers for the US and its allies. Simultaneously, Jack Northrop embarked on drafting plans for an innovative flying wing, envisioning a design where all control surfaces, including the rudders, were integrated into the trailing edge. This revolutionary approach aimed to eliminate the traditional tail, resulting in a pure flying wing. By the summer of 1940, Jack Northrop and his design team initiated test flights for their groundbreaking prototype, the N1M, conducted on the deserted dry lake bed known as Muroc Army Airfield, just north of Los Angeles. Similar to Northrop's 1929 wing, the N1M prototype faced challenges.
It was very underpowered. When they flew it out of Hawthorne, they wanted to move it to Edwards, which was Muroc at that time. They towed it over the hill with a DC-3. Didn't have the power to get over the hills. Well, it was the first successful wing. I don't know for what period of time they flew it, but it's now in the Smithsonian.
Despite the installation of a more suitable engine, the aircraft underwent 200 test flights at Muroc. Throughout this period, Northrop tirelessly sought solutions to the inherent stability issues prevalent in Tailless aircraft designs. The quest for an optimal solution to control the phenomenon known as yaw presented the most formidable challenge.
Yaw is your left and right, where the airplane tends to yaw about its vertical axis. On a conventional airplane, this is controlled by rudder. On a winged vehicle, you have to have some device that creates drag at the wingtip to control or create yaw.
In 1941, General Hap Arnold, the commander of the U.S. Army Air Corps, took the notice of Northrop's N-1M. Arnold, actively searching for a new bomber capable of reaching Germany from the United States, recognized the strategic importance of such an aircraft. Although the United States had not yet declared war against Germany and Japan, the escalating concerns about Nazi Germany's successful air campaign against Britain raised the possibility of the Allies lacking secure air bases in Europe.
In 1940, when it was obvious that the British were in serious trouble and they may fall, with leaving just the United States to stand against Nazi Germany and the Axis powers, the Army Air Corps started looking for a super long-range bomber to be able to strike targets in Europe from continental United States.
The Army Air Corps issued a request for designs, specifically seeking a high-altitude bomber capable of carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs to its target and returning home, covering a total distance of 10,000 miles. Impressed by what he observed during a visit to Northrop at Muroc Field, General Hap Arnold, on November 22, 1941, signed a contract with Northrop to further develop his flying wing bomber, the N-1M.
It offered the possibility of ultra-long range. The flying wing was becoming more and more recognized as advanced. The aerodynamic aspects of it were quite evident, and the long range because of the low drag induced by the aircraft itself. Plus, we had to start thinking very progressively. We couldn't think of just a regular aircraft to get across the continental United States or across the North Atlantic or anywhere in the world.
Just 2 weeks later, on December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, propelling America into a global war. In this tumultuous period, Jack Northrop's dream of seeing the flying wing enter large-scale production seemed on the brink of realization. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor prompted the United States to declare war against the Axis powers and injected a renewed sense of urgency into the development of Jack Northrop's flying wing superbomber, the B-35. To hasten the testing of the design, the Army allocated funds for the construction of experimental prototype versions, which were 1/3 the size of the B-35, reflecting the nation's determination to expedite the development of advanced aircraft during this critical time in history. Looking like something out of a Buck Rogers matinee, these aircraft, with the designation N-9M, first took flight in December 1942. The fully restored N-9MB, currently the sole flying example, occasionally graces the skies near its home at the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California.
The wingspan of the B-35 was 179 feet. This is roughly 60 feet. So it's 1/3 scale, same airfoil, same sweep, same dihedral, just scaled 1/3. The thrust center line of the two engines replicates the center line thrust of the 4 engines on the B-35, and the thrust to weight ratio is roughly the same.
Among its numerous innovations, the Northrop N-9M holds the distinction of being the first aircraft equipped with hydraulically boosted flight controls. The wing itself featured groundbreaking control surfaces, with Northrop ingeniously combining the functions of the aileron and elevator into a single component called an elevon.
This is your primary pitch and roll control. That is, if they both go up and down, you get a pitch input, and if they're differential, you get a roll input. It's where you bank. Out here is the rudder, which is a drag device. It splits, it creates a drag on the wingtip.
Normal airplane has a rudder at the back of the airplane, if you recall, on a fuselage for directional turns and so forth. So he had to basically invent how he would actually steer or fly the airplane.
To address the absence of a traditional tail, the N-9M's design incorporated elevons, creating a distinctive flying experience for its pilots. This uniqueness remains evident in today's aviation landscape.
Flies very well once you get used to it. Not difficult, just different. It's very meaningful to fly this. Certainly it would be to anybody that would have that opportunity. It's a very historic airplane, and once you see it fly, you understand why.
However, concurrently with Jack Northrop's endeavors in developing the flying wing bomber, a formidable competitor was also taking shape, the Convair B-36. It was developed by a group of engineers, including Robert Widmer.
I got involved with the B-36 in order to run the first wind tunnel test, subsonic wind tunnel test, which was to be run at MIT. And I was asked to run that program.
The B-36 emerged in response to the same Army Air Corps requirement for a bomber with the 10,000-mile range and 10,000-pound payload. However, it stood in stark contrast to Jack Northrop's vision of beauty and efficiency embodied in the flying wing. In essence, the B-36 adopted a completely conventional design, diverging sharply from Northrop's aesthetic preferences. Its distinguishing feature was its sheer size, an unparalleled enormity in the history of aviation. The B-36 boasted a wingspan of 230 feet, surpassing the Wright brothers' inaugural flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, by over 100 feet.
The aircraft was going to be so large, they had to save weight any way they could. So it meant using new tanks to hold new types of gases to use for fire extinguishers on the engine. Something as simple as that sounding takes quite a bit of effort. You have to have new engines willing to pull this aircraft, or push it, as it turns out, for 2 days essentially on a mission and not stop.
This colossal aircraft overshadowed Northrop's B-35 design in every aspect, notably in the range and payload. Despite its impressive dimensions, the B-36 faced developmental challenges of its own. Consequently, the Army Air Corps chose to persist with Northrop's flying wing, recognizing its potential.
In case one failed, the other was there. And when you're talking about national survival, having a second option, even if it's expensive, the treasure needs to be spent to save the blood of the Republic later. And that's what they were doing. So it gave a fallback option.
As Jack Northrop continued refining his work on the B-35 bomber, he simultaneously delved deeper into exploring the possibilities and capabilities inherent in the flying wing concept.
Northrop also designed several flying wing fighters. I'm thinking of the P-79V flying ram, powered by twin Westinghouse turbojets. And it was a rather unique aircraft, and unfortunately, the war ended, they didn't do much with it.
Northrop also built the MX-334 rocket wing fighter, America's first rocket-powered airplane, and the piston-powered XP-56 Black Bullet. Despite their promise, both the flying wing bomber and the B-36 encountered substantial development issues and never transitioned into full-scale production. In 1944, as focus shifted towards the larger and more heavily payloaded B-36, the Army reconsidered the future of the B-35. Rather than pursuing its role as a heavy bomber, the Army envisioned the B-35 as a potential experimental medium-range bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. The urgency for such craft diminished with the non-occurrence of the potential crisis that had initially spurred the development of the flying wing bomber and the B-36, the fall of Britain. The heavy bomber role within the U.S. Air Force was, in the meantime, fulfilled by a series of other aircraft such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and the B-29 Superfortress, none of which were connected to Jack Northrop. In August 1945, one of the war's concluding acts saw the B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, dropping the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another B-29 targeted Nagasaki with a second atomic bomb. These events underscored the immense power wielded by bomber aircraft in the nuclear role. With the distant Soviet Union emerging as America's likely adversary in the post-war era, the urgent need for a new long-range heavy payload bomber became more apparent than ever.
What the atomic bomb does for air power is, for the first time, aviators can do what they say they can do. They can take out a strategic target, because now they don't have to send 1,000 planes across to do one job and go back. Now, one aircraft, one bomb, can take out an entire industrial complex or an entire city if it's necessary to do so.
The geopolitical landscape and advent of nuclear capabilities elevated the importance of advanced bomber aircraft for strategic purposes. Partly for this reason, development efforts on Jack Northrop's B-35 as a potential long-range nuclear bomber continued. In June 1946, almost a year after the war's end, Northrop's B-35 finally took flight. Measuring an impressive 172 feet from wingtip to wingtip, The B-35 was equipped with 4 robust 12,000 horsepower piston engines, each driving a pair of counter-rotating pusher propellers. The aircraft's 9-man crew included 3 gunners responsible for defending the plane with 50 caliber machine guns and remotely controlled barbettes. Despite the aircraft's futuristic appearance, the wing design presented challenges for Jack Northrop.
Jack Northrop had just a run of bad luck. The first aircraft crashed before he could draw the technical data that he needed from that aircraft, so he had to proceed with the second prototype. Without the necessary information that he would have garnered from the first one, it put the aircraft at a great disadvantage.
While he had successfully overcome various design obstacles, finding a viable solution to the problem of yawing proved elusive. The B-35 also grappled with issues such as overheating engines and gearshift vibration. Faced with these challenges, Northrop decided to integrate a new technology into the wing, turbojets. By this time, turbojets had become the preferred propulsion method for all new military aircraft. Experimental versions of the wings were outfitted with 8 turbojet engines, leading to its redesignation as the YB-49. The introduction of jet propulsion brought a transformative improvement in performance, swiftly resolving developmental problems like gearshaft vibration. Some test pilots even reported that the wings exhibited flight characteristics more reminiscent of a fighter than a traditional bomber, highlighting the positive impact of the shift to jet technology. At Northrop's suggestion, test pilot Robert Cardenas demonstrated the wing speed by undertaking a cross-country flight.
At an unofficial speed record from Edwards all the way back to Andrews Air Force Base, showed it off to President Truman, and Truman went through the airplane and saw it flying, and he thought we ought to buy some of these.
The transition to larger jet engines on the YB-49 posed significant challenges, as it reduced the wing's bomb capability precisely when a much larger payload and range, akin to that of the B-36, were needed to transport the massive and heavy atomic bombs in use at the time all the way to the Soviet Union. Furthermore, Jack Northrop's wings still grappled with serious stability issues. On June 5, 1948, during a series of stall tests on the YB-49, Danny Forbes and Major Glenn Edwards were at the controls. The night before, Edwards had expressed optimism about the wing's progress, noting its impressive performance despite numerous test flights and extensive flying hours. However, he acknowledged that the stability remained a significant problem, adding, "But the plane goes like hell." Tragically, during the tests that day, the pilot lost control of the aircraft, resulting in a crash and fire that claimed the lives of all 5 crew members. In honor of Major Glenn Edwards, the base at Muroc was renamed Edwards Air Force Base when the U.S. Air Force was officially established as a separate military branch. This renaming commemorated the sacrifice of those involved in advancing aviation and aeronautical innovation. Fearing that his beloved flying wing was doomed as a military project because of high-profile failures like the Glenn Edwards crash, Jack Northrop launched a publicity campaign promoting the flying wing as the airliner of tomorrow.
Now, a preview of the flying wing transport of tomorrow. The midsection provides ample room for 80 passengers. Spaciousness keynotes the luxurious main lounge, extending 53 feet inside the wing. And future air travelers will really see something. Through the plexiglass windows of the front wing edge, passengers have an unimpaired view of the Earth unrolling thousands of feet below. Coast-to-coast flights in 4 hours may not be too far away.
Despite earnest efforts, no civilian air service expressed interest in the flying wing, leading to the U.S. Air Force's decision to cancel Northrop's contract in 1948. Instead, they opted to proceed with the Convair B-36. The cancellation of the flying wing project remains a contentious decision, with accusations of political bias favoring Convair mingling with the concerns about issues with the YB-49. Critics argued that political considerations played a role in the decision-making process, but undeniable were the significant stability problems inherent in the flying wing design. Many viewed the YB-49 as unstable both as a bombing platform and a long-range reconnaissance aircraft.
It was understood by the Air Force at the time, even when they canceled the program. It had great potentials, but not quite now. Maybe someday in the future.
For Jack Northrop, the most devastating blow came when the Air Force ordered the destruction of all existing flying wings, melting them down into aluminum ingots.
It was devastating. Come in, see strangers come in and cut up your product right in front of your employees. It was really disheartening, of course.
This experience deeply disturbed Northrop, prompting him to leave his company and take an early retirement, completely withdrawn from the aviation industry. In the race to be armed and ready for the Cold War, the B-36 emerged victorious over the Flying Wing. For the next decade, the B-36's colossal presence dominated the skies, serving as the backbone for America's nuclear arsenal. On December 7, 1948, exactly 7 years after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a giant silver bird with 6 pusher-type props departed from Carswell Air Force Base, Texas. Over the Pacific, near Hawaii, it opened its bomb bay doors and dropped a payload of 10,000 pounds of dummy bombs into the ocean, symbolizing the era of strategic air power during the Cold War. This airplane was the Convair B-36, and it had demonstrated, among other things, that it was a true intercontinental bomber capable of striking at almost any target in the world. The B-36 embarked on a long and challenging journey, marked by disappointments, delays, and intense controversy from its inception on the drawing board to its eventual operational status.
It was a disaster. We needed to change the wing, and I knew we had to change the control surfaces. We had to put a different kind of fan on because it's a pusher engine to cool the things on the ground statically when it's not moving. The whole airplane had to be totally redesigned here. And we did that.
One pivotal element in the final decision to proceed with the troubled project was the escalating tensions of the Cold War. Air Force Secretary Stuart Symington, recognizing the B-36 as the sole bomber capable of reaching targets inside the Soviet Union, played a crucial role in the program's continuation. The Strategic Air Command, or SAC, led by General Curtis LeMay, emerged as the primary custodian of U.S. nuclear weapons, and the B-36 became the cornerstone of U.S. Cold War strategy.
It was the main part of Strategic Air Command. It was General Curtis E. LeMay's big stick. We flew everywhere, made lots of noise. Of course, there was a big battle going on, whether you should get aircraft carriers or you should get B-36s. And at that time, the B-36 won.
The logistical challenge of finding a sufficiently large facility to assemble the colossal B-36 was formidable.
Do you have floor space to build this monster? It's huge. You need a big hangar to put it in, to build it in. So where do you build it? You have to go to Fort Worth, where they just happen to have a large enough facility, and it's all enclosed so people can't peek in the windows.
The mile-long facility in Fort Worth, Texas, originally constructed for assembling B-24 bombers during World War II, stood as the only building on the planet spacious enough to accommodate the gigantic B-36. In the air, the B-36, often referred to as the Big Stick, boasted an extraordinary fuel capacity, enabling it to remain airborne for 2 days, far surpassing any other bomber in history. Additionally, it was the sole aircraft capable of carrying the exceptionally large and heavy nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal at the time.
People often ask, why did the B-36 have to be so large? Well, it had to carry a lot of fuel to fly long range, but it also had to have a massive bomb bay to carry the large thermonuclear weapons like on either side of the bomb bay. These are massive monsters, and it requires a massive bomb bay to carry them.
With 4 bomb bays, each with a capacity of 3 freight cars, the B-36 could carry a maximum payload of 84,000 pounds, exceeding the gross weight of the B-29. The B-36 thus represented a formidable and unprecedented force during this critical period of Cold War military strategy.
One of the biggest problems was building the frame to build the aircraft. They finally brought in a bridge builder, and he designed what we called a K-type frame that actually was a basic strength holding the fuselage together.
Designing adequate landing gear for the 210-ton plane also posed unique problems.
When it was first designed, the B-36 wheel was the largest aircraft tire in existence in the United States at the time. This had problems. First, the weight of the wheel itself. It could push through any concrete runway at the time, except for a very few within the United States. The planners came up with a 4-wheel design, like on a B-36 that you'll see over here. This aircraft had 4 wheels. First, it lowers the risk if one tire goes out, the plane won't crash on takeoff or landing. Also, by spreading the weight out over 4 tires, it increased the number of runways that the B-36 could operate with.
The original design of the B-36 featured 6 28-cylinder, 4,360 cubic inch turbo-supercharged radial engines, each rated at 3,500 horsepower. However, reaching the promised service ceiling of 40,000 feet posed a formidable challenge, and the top speed of the bomber barely reached 230 miles an hour. Critics raised concerns about the B-36's vulnerability to enemy fighters, particularly the new Soviet MiG-15. The slow-flying bomber was considered by some as a sitting duck, leading to accusations of being a billion-dollar boondoggle. In 1950, congressional hearings were held, sparkling a scandal known as the B-36 affair. Both Convair and the U.S. Air Force underwent an investigation. The controversy further intensified as part of the heated debate between the Air Force and the Navy over which service should control the U.S. nuclear mission in 1951. Efforts to address some of the B-36's issues led to modifications in the form of adding a pair of J-47 turbojet engines under each wing, employing the slogan 4 burning and 6 turning. This modification significantly improved the Big Stick's performance, boosting its top speed to over 400 miles an hour and nearly doubling its rate of climb. With these enhancements, the modified B-36 could operate at higher altitudes than most fighters in the thin atmosphere at those elevations, offering an improved and more formidable version of the aircraft.
Some F-100s challenged us, and they were pretty braggadocio about how their airplanes can fly compared to this old hunk of metal here. 4 of them came in on us into a sharp turn. The guys that turned with us all stalled out and went down a little bit and didn't get us.
The B-36 featured retractable, remotely fired turrets with 20mm cannons located at the top, bottom, front, and rear of the aircraft, establishing it as the more heavily defended bomber in existence.
We were quite well protected if we had fighters coming in on us. We could put a good screen of lead out there.
A distinctive and unique feature of the B-36 was the pressurized tube light passageway, serving as a walkway to move between the front of the airplane and the crew compartment in the rear.
The tube was an 80-foot tube from the forward pressurized compartment to the aft pressurized compartment, and it had a little cart like one of these carts you would lie on working underneath a car. And you would get in there and grab a cable in there and then go to the aft compartment. There were doors on both ends so that if one compartment depressurized, you wouldn't be shot out like a cannon.
Despite its ongoing controversy surrounding the giant bomber, the Convair B-36 effectively fulfilled its role as a deterrent to nuclear war from 1949 to 1959.
At the very time when the American people are most nervous, all of a sudden you have this massive, huge, comforting aircraft that gives the American people a sense of security that allowed us to think things through more clearly, come to rational decisions. So it's a security blanket for the American people, as well as a deterrent to the Soviets.
In 1959, after a decade of service, the B-36 was replaced by the new jet-powered B-52 Stratofortress, another colossal conventional aircraft design. With Jack Northrop in retirement and no other flying wings in development, it seemed like the aeronautical world had moved beyond his dream. It would take nearly 30 years before an aircraft with a strangely familiar shape returned like a boomerang to replace the B-52, the B-2. During the test flights of Jack Northrop's flying wing bomber, one of the surprising outcomes was the difficulty Air Force personnel encountered in trying to track the plane on radar, showcasing the aircraft's advanced stealth capabilities. The B-2, inheriting the legacy of the flying wing, would go on to redefine strategic bomber capabilities with its stealth technology. The most important reason for this was its shape. The elegance and economy of the wing's design meant that it had fewer surfaces to reflect a radar signal back to an enemy receiver than a conventional aircraft. The characteristics of the flying wing, particularly its difficulty to detect on radar, foreshadowed the development of stealth technology.
The advantage of using a stealth technology is that you can use this one aircraft to fly in and you can deliver a precision-guided weapon at your leisure. You don't have to worry nearly as much about enemy air defenses. They have to worry about you instead.
The quest for stealth technology emerged almost immediately after the introduction of radar during World War II. As radar became a ubiquitous element of warfare, efforts were initiated to find ways to deceive it. Early attempts involved jamming German radar with clouds of tinfoil strips, codenamed Window, which proved highly successful. However, little progress was made in the realm of making aircraft themselves less detectable. The inadvertent success of the flying wing in evading radar detection laid the foundation for the deliberate incorporation of stealth technology in subsequent aircraft. The SR-71 and the B-1 bomber were among the first U.S. aircraft to purposefully integrate stealth technology, although it was still in its early stages of development. Interestingly, the advantages in stealth demonstrated by the flying wings seemed to be overlooked following the cancellation of the program. It wasn't until the 1970s, with the Soviet air defense network becoming more formidable, that research on stealth design gained renewed impetus. Operating in secrecy, designers developed several prototypes, ultimately leading to the creation of the F-117 stealth fighter. Characterized by its heavily faceted shape, the F-117 reflects radar signals away from enemy receivers, making a significant leap forward in the evolution of stealth technology. The Flying Wing's early contributions to radar evasion became a critical foundation for the advancements that would follow in the realm of stealth aircraft design. But other scientists at Northrop Aircraft, working on an unrelated project in the early 1960s, had determined that the ideal shape for a stealth plane was actually far different than the angular form of the F-117.
We had a small group of what we called phenomenologists at the time. They were basically physicists and very bright young people with a wide open mind who became curious about why is it that we can see things on radar? Is there a way of having a shaping that would make it difficult to see? They came up with these shapes, and we were startled and pleased because, lo and behold, the shape they came up with was exactly the shape of a flying wing.
In the early 1970s, top-secret development commenced on what would eventually become the B-2 Flying Wing stealth bomber, designed to serve as America's next-generation nuclear transcontinental heavy bomber.
Essentially, it needed to be, number one, stealthy for future technologies and future enemy radar systems. It needed to have a large payload capacity. Thirdly, it needed to be precise. Lastly, it needed long range, intercontinental.
Similar to the challenges faced by the YB-49 and B-36, overcoming technological problems was just one aspect of the difficulties encountered during the development of the stealth bomber. Initiated during President Carter's administration, the B-2 project faced cancellation in the early days of President Reagan's first term, only to later be revived. Despite controversy, significant technical challenges, and substantial cost overruns, the development of the aircraft persisted. In the spring of 1980, an ailing and wheelchair-bound Jack Northrop visited the Northrop plant, where he was shown models for the future B-2 bomber. Notably, the B-2 was planned to have a wingspan of 172 feet, identical to Northrop's B-35 and YB-49. Touched by the experience, Northrop, who had less than a year to live, expressed, "Now I know why God has kept me alive the last 25 years." 8 years later, on November 22, 1988, the first B-2 Spirit was unveiled at the Northrop Site 4 facility in Palmdale, California. During the event, as the doors opened, Northrop President and CEO Thomas Jones made a spontaneous announcement, marking a significant milestone in the realization of Jack Northrop's enduring vision.
I was standing there, and obviously you get overcome by things, and you see this beautiful airplane come out, and you see this great crowd of people, and so on, and just said, "Jack Northrop, we salute you," which we all said.
The development of computer-assisted fly-by-wire flight controls, which were already being used by the F-117 and other advanced military aircraft, meant that the stability problems which had plagued Northrop's flying wing were no longer an issue in the stealth bomber.
The yaw developed as an inherent trait with a flying wing. What allows us to solve that problem now is the flight control computers are so fast that they're able to make the flight controls move fast enough that it stops that yawing from occurring. Conventional airplanes, early on, you physically would pull on the control stick, and it would move a series of cables and bellows and pulleys to make it all work. What fly-by-wire now does for us is allows the pilot to move the stick, and now computers take care of all that mechanical control, and it sends a computer signal out, just like calling on a telephone.
The aerodynamic efficiency inherent in Northrop's flying wing design paid dividends in the B-2 by allowing its engines to operate at lower power settings, contributing to a quieter operation of the aircraft. Notably, the grandson of the pilot who flew Enola Gay on the world's first nuclear mission is one of the pilots of these remarkable aircraft.
When you look at it, you don't really see any engines. You see a couple of small intake holes on the front, a couple of small exhaust holes on the back, and that's about it. All of that works together to help reduce the signature and make the airplane more stealthy.
Another key factor in the B-2's stealth compatibilities lies in the use of graphite composite material, which effectively absorbs radar energy. Maintaining a completely smooth surface on the airplane is also crucial in achieving optimal stealth characteristics.
With this aircraft, you have to be more careful not to scratch the paint and the surfaces and flight control surfaces. If I bump this craft with a stand, I'm liable to do anywhere from 30 to 40 hours worth of damage on a small scratch. With that paint missing, it's liable to get the radar absorbed and possibly point your position out to who's ever trying to track you.
These qualities collectively contribute to the B-2's remarkable success in the realm of stealth, providing it with the radar reflectivity equivalent to that of a basketball. Despite the challenges faced during its journey to production, the B-2 bomber had become the cornerstone of America's nuclear bomber force. However, its initial deployment in combat did not involve a centerpiece role in an atomic superpower showdown, but rather in a more conventional foreign conflict. In the early morning hours of March 24, 1999, two B-2 stealth bombers took off from their base at Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, marking a significant moment in the operational history of the B-2 in a more conventional military context. They crossed the North American continent, then the Atlantic, en route to targeted facilities in the former Yugoslavia.
I was going into my first mission, and I had stealthed up. When the controller came back to me, he said, "I've lost you on radar." And I tell you, that was just like a warm, fuzzy, reassuring feeling. Gave you goose pimples like, hey, this actually does work.
Approaching their targets with precision, the B-2 stealth bombers utilized their launch and leave capabilities during this crisis in Kosovo, successfully deploying 30 2,000-pound satellite-guided smart bombs. These smart bombs were designed to land within 30 feet of their programmed coordinates, showcasing the B-2's accuracy in delivering payloads.
When my weapons bay doors opened and the weapons started coming out, those 2,000-pounders coming out just shuttered the airplane. Don't, don't. That's when the reality of what we actually were doing really hit pretty hard. And we started to see surface-to-air missiles being shot. It started just sinking in that, hey, this is for real.
After dropping their bombs, the bombers returned to Whiteman Air Force Base approximately 31 hours after takeoff. Notably, the B-2s executed their missions in a manner that often left the enemy unaware of their presence overhead. A highlight of the stealth bombers' weaponry during the Kosovo crisis was the deployment of the Joint Direct Attack munitions. JDAM transformed unguided bombs into highly precise weapons, contributing to the success of the B-2 in the 78-day air campaign.
We strapped on a tail kit. It has fins that move, and these GPS satellites, the global positioning system, feeds it current information, updating it all the time, all the way down until it strikes the target.
Throughout the campaign, B-2 Spirits flew 49 missions, with all aircraft and their crews performing flawlessly, marking an impressive combat debut for the Flying Wing stealth bomber.
49 for 49 on-town takeoffs, done with only 6 aircraft at the time. That's all we had here on this base. That's an amazing feat, to be able to keep that ops tempo at such a high level. Aircraft were talking to each other, coming and going into targets. That's a unique concept of warfare that this nation or the world has never seen, where you have warriors taking off, going into combat, and returning home after a 30-hour mission, walking home into the house and honey, what'd you do today?
The 30-hour missions were exhausting, but the B-2 crew tried to find a way to stay occupied during the long flight.
15 hours on the way out are broken up by a couple of every fuelings every 4 hours or so. And then you do your bombing and then you come back home, same thing. So what we try to do is maximize the amount of downtime to relax, to study our targets, anything we can to keep our bodies as fresh as we can during the sortie.
Despite the successes in Kosovo, the B-2's substantial cost had remained a focal point of controversy. Originally planned as a fleet of 132 stealth bombers, the program was scaled down significantly, resulting in a total force of only 21 B-2s. Nevertheless, the B-2 is a vital part of a trio of long-range multi-purpose bombers that also includes the B-1 and the venerable B-52.
We've got some weapons upgrades coming along the line. We've just been certified with the Joint Standoff Weapon, starting into the cruise missile concept. So the B-2 can actually, if it has to, fight its way into a target area by launching cruise missiles and then delivering the JDAM, Joint Direct Attack Munition, which is extremely accurate.
With the B-2, you can go out, you can fly long distances, You can destroy targets within tens and sometimes ones of feet with precision weapons through any kind of weather that's out there. So if no one else can fly that night because the target area is socked in, here comes the mighty B-2 with its precision-guided weapons that doesn't need any assistance, comes in, delivers its weapons, and goes back home. That's why you need the B-2.
With our stealth capability, it allows us to be first in and create holes in the defensive environment that the conventional airplanes can now use to strike effectively. The B-2 is capable of getting in there first strike and basically putting the lights out.
The V-2 is definitely a long-term aircraft. The design is proven. The concept behind the design will last for a very long time. And its airframe, again, is just a very simple design that is so effective.
The B-2, proven in combat with its advanced stealth technology and versatility as both a nuclear deterrent and a multi-purpose bomber, is likely to remain a key element of the U.S. global military strategy for decades to come.
When you see the B-2 fly over and give you that profile of the flying wing, it is a stylish aircraft. It just shows efficiency mixed with style. I think the legacy of Northrop is to point the way to the future so that engineers today and in the future can look at what this man did and can move forward and take the United States into new technological realms of aviation.
However, despite the extraordinary success of the B-2, Jack Northrop's dream of fulfilling the skies with graceful flying wings has not yet been fully realized. Various challenges, including the expense and complexity of the computerized control systems needed for the flight stability, continue to impede the broader commercial acceptance of the flying wing concept. Nevertheless, as futuristic wing-like designs are once again being developed around the world, there is still a possibility that Jack Northrop's version of the flying wing, or something very much like it, could still represent the shape of things to come in aviation. Britain's nuclear V-force reached its operational zenith by 1964. If necessary, more than 150 Valiants, Victors, and Vulcans could be quickly deployed from makeshift airfields across the British Isles. The aircraft could be airborne within 4 minutes, armed with a blue steel nuclear missile. A single aircraft possessed the capability to deliver a devastating strike deep within the heart of the Soviet Union. This was the era of QRA, Quick Reaction Alert. The Royal Air Force Bomber Command reached its peak in terms of size and strength during the final months of the Second World War. Night after night, hundreds of Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers were dispatched to pummel the German homeland with millions of tons of bombs. Collaborating closely with the U.S. Air Force, the Allied bomber formations systematically devastated industrial, civilian, and military centers, playing a pivotal role in the ultimate victory in Europe. But the cost was high. Even though they were heavily armored and equipped with defensive weapons, the heavy bombers still remained susceptible to attacks. Conversely, the de Havilland Mosquito exhibited remarkably high levels of survivability, even though it was completely unarmed. The key lay in its ability to fly at high speed at altitudes that put it beyond the German defenses. In 1945, as the Allies advanced across Western Europe and into Germany, numerous aircraft research facilities fell into their hands. American, British, and Russian scientists all stood to gain immensely from the data obtained from the Germans, as they would delve into every facet of aeronautical design. Of particular interest with the advances in turbojet and wing technology. The Messerschmitt 262 had been the world's first jet bomber, even though it was designed as a fighter. It turned out to be entirely unsuitable for bombing missions, as it couldn't carry a sufficient payload to inflict substantial damage. However, as a fighter aircraft, it could outperform any other aircraft operated by the Allied air forces. Swept wings, just like those on the 262, would become standard features for years to come. The Germans had also experimented with the delta wing design through the Messerschmitt 163 Comet interceptor. These, along with other aircraft such as the Arado 234, collectively indicated that aircraft design was on a verge of a new era. Meanwhile, the war in the Far East was at risk of grinding towards a stalemate. Despite the impending invasion of their homeland, the Japanese refused to surrender and even resorted to suicide attacks against American ships. Then, on August 6, 1945, a single Boeing B-29 Superfortress, flying at an altitude of 32,000 feet, released an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. The device was a free-fall bomb timed to detonate at 1,900 feet above ground level, with a power equivalent to 12,500 tons of TNT. 3 days later, a bomb with a power equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan quickly surrendered, and the Second World War was over. In an instant, the age-old debates about what defines strategic power became glaringly clear, thanks to the nuclear bomb. As peace emerged, there were inevitable reductions in military expenditures, even though there remained concerns about Soviet intentions in Europe and the Far East. Demobilization provided a natural means of reducing numbers of RAF personnel, but other cutbacks would hurt much more. Production contracts, and in particular aeronautic research projects, were either drastically cut back or cancelled. Britain's lead in aeronautics and air engine design, which it had enjoyed at the war's conclusion, was nearly obliterated within a year. For Bomber Command, this meant that the Avro Lincoln, which had succeeded the Lancaster, would need to remain in service into the 1950s. However, the Lincoln belonged to a bygone era. Not only was it slower in comparison to the emerging jet bombers, but it also had limited range and, most crucially, lacked the capacity to carry a nuclear bomb. As a solution to this last problem, Bomber Command was to be equipped with Boeing B-29s, leased from the Americans. Whilst it was undoubtedly capable of carrying an atom bomb, it was still a Second World War bomber, and not the kind of aircraft the RAF needed to take into the nuclear era. However, amid this otherwise gloomy picture, a ray of hope emerged. The RAF had the distinction of being the first Allied Air Force to operate a jet-powered aircraft, the Gloucester Meteor. While the initial performance of the early Meteors left much to be desired, they nonetheless offered the RAF invaluable experience in jet flight. The Air Ministry was resolute in its determination to introduce a jet bomber into service as swiftly as possible. Even before the war's end, a new specification was issued for a light bomber propelled by twin jet engines, intended to serve as a successor to the Mosquito. The result was the English Electric Canberra, which would go on to serve the RAF and US Air Force for over 40 years. Although a relatively conventional design with truck unswept wings, it could still fly at a speed and altitude beyond the reach of any of the jet fighters of the day. However, the aircraft specified for the task could not only carry a payload of 6,000 pounds of bombs, falling short of the Bomber's Command's need for the capacity to carry nuclear weapons weighing 10,000 pounds. As a result, in January 1947, additional specifications were issued, demanding aircraft with the capability to penetrate the enemy defenses at high altitudes, evade interception through their jet-powered and high-speed performance, and if required, deliver a nuclear weapon. Despite the spending cuts, the British aviation community was led by men of extraordinary vision and entrepreneurial spirit. Men like George Edwards at Vickers, Roy Chadwick with the support of Sir Roy Dobson at Avro, Reginald Strafford and Geoffrey Lee in the employment of Sir Frederick Handley Page of Handley Page fame, shared an intense rivalry that proved as fruitful as it was fierce.
At one stage, and I can't recall exactly when this happened, Handley Page design team and Avro design team decided that it would be worthwhile them comparing notes about the Vulcan and the Victor and trying to achieve the best result for the country as a whole. And a meeting was actually formed at Cricklewood with Avro designers attending and discussing, or starting at the beginning of the meeting to discuss the merits of each other's designs, when Sir Roy Dobson at Avro's found out what was going on, because he wanted to see one of the people that turned out to be Radlett, and he said, "What?" Or at Cricklewood, he said, "What's he doing at Cricklewood?" Discussing the Vulcan with Handley Page was the answer. He said, "Get him on the phone and bring all those people back instantly." And the meeting was stopped at about a quarter of the way through, I understand, and that was about the end of that. That was the way it went on, yes.
Out of the rivalry came some of the most dramatic and exciting aircraft ever to fly. Brought together into a fighting unit, they became known as the V-Force. The first of the aircraft to fly was the Vickers Type 660, making its maiden flight on May the 18th, 1951, with Mutt Summers at the controls. A month later, it was christened the Valiant, following a poll among Vickers employees to find a suitable name. The Valiant served as a replacement for the short SA-4 Sparran, which had experienced numerous delays and had not yet taken flight. It had become evident, however, that the Sparran's performance would not meet expectations. The Valiant was far from a mundane design. By the austere standards of its time, it stood as an impressive endeavor, excelling both in terms of aerodynamics and structural capability. The dimensions of the fuselage were dictated by the need to carry the H-2S radar scanner in the nose, the pressurized cabin accommodating a crew of 5, and the dimensions of the bomb bay. The airframe structure was entered on a massive backbone member extending along the top of the fuselage. The wing spars extended from the fuselage backbone, providing the Valiant with its robust shoulder-mounted wings. These wings boasted a compound sweep design, characterized by a more acute angle of sweep at the root rather than the tips. The Valiant incorporated 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets, each capable of generating 6,500 pounds of thrust, nestled within the wing root area. However, one of the key innovations of the Valiant was the utilization of entirely electric systems, contributing to the aircraft's lightweight and ease of handling.
But my first flight in the Valiant at RF Gaydon, when I did the conversion, was that of size. You could tell that you were handling something much larger, but still relatively light on the controls because of things like power controls, power-operated controls. And there really wasn't a great deal different in the technique. One could say that it was a larger, like a 4-engine Canberra.
The Valiant was a remarkable achievement. George Edwards had successfully persuaded the air staff that not only could he have a flying prototype of the Valiant prepared by 1951, but the production models would also be ready before the conclusion of 1953. The aligning timeline was precisely what the air staff desired, considering the broader political developments that were starting to take shape. The Berlin blockade in 1948, followed by the building of the Berlin Wall, marked the beginning of the Cold War. Soon, there would be war in Korea. Finally, the Soviets' nuclear bomb program was at an advanced stage. By 1949, they had detonated their first nuclear device, a nuclear plant of the new member. The pressure was unrelenting, but on August 30th, 1952, the next aircraft in the V-bomber series, the Avro Type 698, took its inaugural flight.
Now, with respect, the day we rolled it out, on that Saturday morning, I think it was August the 5th, I forget now, 1952, and Rowley Fault flew it, the superintendent of flying, and Rowley Fault walked out of that aircraft with just his lounge suit on and his leather helmet, just as if he was going for an afternoon's drive. When he went down the runway, he lifted it, and we thought, oh no, he's not good. And he was up. He didn't lift the undercarriage, he was airborne for 2.25 hours. Now that 2.25 hours that he was airborne, he stopped the whole of the traffic in the Manchester area. They'd never seen anything like it, because it was a great Delta bomber, They'd seen the little ones flying, but not a big one like that. They all thought they were being invaded from outer space. Their telephones were red hot, police cars were tearing about, this, that, the other. Because it was all kept hush hush. We'd kept it shut up down there. He came back, he landed it, and he just got out, and he walked, and we all clapped him, and he just raised his hand, he just walked away as if he'd just been out for an afternoon driving a Mini Minor. Now then, a week later, he was taking the aircraft down to Farnborough to the air show. And he took off from here again on his own. And when he got to Farnborough, he rolled it like a fighter. He got a bollocking for it, but he still rolled it. We all heard about this. We thought, oh, we can't have it, but he did. Now, 10 days later, he's going back to Woodford with it. And we knew he'd arranged to fly it back at dinner time because all the crowd were outside to watch him come in with it. This marvellous aircraft that had been built at Woodford. We saw him coming. He comes over the new assembly, which is the building across the road, the assembly sheds, and he reaches the end of the boiler house. He spins it and rolls it like over the factory from one end to the other, straightens it up in the air, shatters everything, lands it and just walks away. And he broke all the glass in the roof, cracked it. And the glass in the roof was taped up for many years till the roof was redone.
From the very beginning, the aircraft, which later became known as the Vulcan, was acknowledged as an exceedingly advanced design, excelling both in aerodynamics and as a manufacturing feat. Notably, the Type 698 had been originally conceived by Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, who tragically passed away before he could learn that the Air Ministry had accepted Avro's proposal. In order to investigate the flying properties of the Delta Wing, 1/3 scale replicas were built. Designated as the 707, 2 of these aircraft were constructed to explore the flight characteristics of a Delta Wing at slow speeds, while the other 2 were built to investigate high-speed properties. Nonetheless, the pace of development within the Type 698 program was so rapid that by the time the first 707 took to the skies in 1951, metal was already being cut for the Vulcan prototype. Initially, the prototypes were equipped with 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets, but it's the Bristol Olympus series of engines that have become synonymous with the Vulcan's remarkable performance. However, further test flights conducted at Boscombe Down uncovered issues with the nearly perfect delta shape. Buffeting occurred when the aircraft pulled G-forces at high altitudes, which, in the long run, could shorten the fatigue life of the aircraft structure. The solution was to incorporate a kink into the leading edge, so that the inboard sweep was reduced, whilst the output sweep was increased. This would become the standard layout for all future Vulcans, and one which made the flying Vulcan a truly unforgettable experience.
I think the combination of perhaps the installed engine power and also a technicality that the aircraft performance frequently depends on the ratio of its weight to its wing area. The more the wing area for a given weight, the tighter the aircraft can turn. Plus, the Vulcan, the sort of triangular shape, was inherently strong, which gave it, I think, probably slightly higher G limits than the other aircraft. And certainly that combination gives you the very tight turns, plus fighter-type control column, a lot of manoeuvrability. I mean, we thought it was wonderful, and just before the Falklands, we had the Victor pilots come up and train us for the tanking. And yes, of course, their first love is the Victor, and they would defend it to their dying day. But I think they were impressed by the Vulcan. They rather liked what they saw. I remember Pete standing, we did a couple of manoeuvres, and he sort of said, oh, can I do that again? And we did them so many times that the fuel got a little bit low. He was really enjoying himself. Lovely aircraft.
The formidable reputation of a 4-engine jet bomber, which sounded rather fearsome, was dispelled by the Vulcan, which was, in many ways, a very good fighter in performance terms, and beautifully easy to handle, and very few, compared with the Canberra, potential malfunctions and disasters.
While the Valiant was undergoing flight trials, the third V-bomber prototype, the Victor, was nearing completion. The Victor ultimately held the distinction of being the longest-serving V-bomber, remaining in service with the RAF Strike Command until 1993. It was also the first heavy bomber to go supersonic.
So we did another run and went to about the same indicated Mach number, and that was it. and there were no handling problems. Everything worked perfectly normally. The whole airplane was smooth without any shaking. There was no evidence of exceeding Mach 1 in terms of trim changes or anything at all. The whole thing was perfectly smooth. And we returned to Radlett. And when I got back, I went into the control tower to see the air traffic controller, and I said, "You didn't happen to hear a supersonic bang at about 20 past 11 this morning, did you?" "No." So I asked one or two others around. No, nobody, didn't seem to occur to anybody. So that was that. But on Monday morning, we discovered, this was a Saturday, in fact we were doing this, on Monday morning we discovered that there had been a good supersonic bang all over Watford and one or two other places. And it so happened that Charles Joy, the chief designer at Handley Page, had been shopping in Watford, and he'd witnessed it, and he knew what the time was. And the time coincided precisely. And so there was no argument. But, of course, the aerodynamicists immediately took all our records and this, that, and the other off the aeroplane and analyzed them and said, yep, it was supersonic.
As early as 1945, Sir Frederick Handley Page recognized that the RAF would need a jet bomber to replace the Lincolns. Consequently, he directed his design team to begin work on a bomber design. During 1946, the design was developed into a formal proposal. At the time, there was very little data available about the flying characteristics of a delta wing, and it was thought that such a design would be rendered unworkable due to stability problems. As a compromise, Handley Page opted for the crescent wing shape.
With the crescent wing, what happens is that the inner part of the wing, close to the fuselage, is the thickest part. It houses the engines and all the structure to carry the rest of the wing. And as the wing moves out, away from there, you can let it get thinner. So you achieve your high Mach number characteristics on the inboard section of the wing by sweeping it heavily. As you progress outboard, where the wing gets thinner, to achieve the same high Mach number characteristic, you don't need to sweep it so much. And so in the case of the Victor, there was high sweep inboard, and then that cut off in two stages out towards the tip. So the tips were not anything like as swept back as the rest of the leading edge of the wing, or the inboard part of the leading edge. And this achieved similar high-speed characteristics right across the wing. Didn't help the low-speed handling, but it was good for high speed, and that's what was needed.
By April 1948, the design had been refined sufficiently for a contract for 2 prototypes to be built. The Victor, as it was officially named, was set to be equipped with 4 Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire turbojets, each capable of producing 7,500 pounds of thrust. Similar to the Valiant and the Vulcan, these engines were embedded deep within the wing roots. The initially introduced wingtip fins were eventually eliminated, and, following guidance from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the tailplane was relocated from its mid-position to the top of the vertical fin. The tailplane was a huge fixed section, with a pair of large elevators. Its span was just 11 inches shorter than the wingspan of the Hawker Hunter. To explore the characteristics of their design still further, Handley Page decided to construct a piloted flying model, the HP-88. The exercise proved to be almost pointless, as the Victor program continued independently of the smaller research vehicle. The Victor was not only aerodynamically advanced, but also pushed the boundaries of manufacturing expertise. Its construction employed a honeycomb sandwich structure, which was either riveted or spot-welded to the wing and fuselage frames. Not only was this immensely strong, but also very light. The first prototype was assembled at Radlett in anticipation that this is from where the Victor would make its first flight. The Ministry of Supply, however, expressed concerns about the runway's length, and instead that the aircraft be transported to Buscombe Down, camouflaged to resemble a boat. With utmost secrecy, the Victor was assembled and prepared for its inaugural flight.
We didn't know anything about it until B Squadron's hangar, which was the one that I was working from, had to have a lot of space cleared in it suddenly. And we didn't really know why. But on the Monday morning when we came to work, we discovered the reason was that it was full of chunks of Victor, and that people were busily, even almost immediately, starting to put this thing back together. And yes, I mean, the whole thing was still terribly hush-hush, but then the whole of Boscombe Down was, everything was sworn to secrecy. You weren't allowed to go outside the place and talk about it, but you could talk about it inside the place. They couldn't stop us. It was in our hangar, and we began to see this thing being built. And it was really quite a revolutionary affair, I can tell you, in those days, for a big aeroplane. I mean, swept wing aeroplanes were about for small ones, but for a big aeroplane, this really looked quite fantastic. And then we saw the outer wings put on with these great chunks of nose flap hanging down. That looked quite extraordinary in those days.
Then, on Christmas Eve in 1952, favorable conditions aligned, and the Victor made its maiden flight, piloted by Chief Test Pilot Squadron Leader Hedley George Hazelden. The Victor flew as well as it looked, and in the years that followed would leave an indelible impression on all who flew it.
Well, once again, not unlike the Valiant, it was immediately a super piece of equipment to fly and comfortable, and you felt at home with it straight away. And fairly soon after I started flying it, I was able to take it to high altitude, and I quite early on had it up to 50,000 feet without any trouble, much more easily than I'd ever had anything else up to that height. And the only previous aeroplane I'd had that high was a Canberra in Boscombe Down days. And it got there much more easily. And the other great thing about it was that its Mach number capability was so good, it didn't have any, or at least any apparent compressibility problems. At any Mach number up to about 0.93, which was really going some in those days, because most aeroplanes were getting into trouble around 0.82 Mach number.
On the 15th of July 1953, the Victor made its public debut at the Queen's Coronation Review at Odium. As wave after wave of aircraft flew past in salute, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth must have marveled at the strength and power of her air force. In the near future, the Meteors and Vampires would make way for Hawker Hunters and English Electric Lightnings, enhancing the country's aerial defense capabilities. The Washingtons would be returned to America within months, as Britain now had laid the foundation for a modern jet bomber force that could stand toe-to-toe with any other in the world. All that was needed now was a nuclear weapon to guarantee Britain's status as a superpower. The assumption that it would be an American nuclear bomb had been abruptly cut short in 1947, when the U.S. passed the Atomic Energy Act as proposed by Senator McMahon. The act prohibited any further cooperation with Britain over atomic research, despite the role played by British scientists in building the first American atom bomb. Driven by America's isolationist policy, Britain found itself compelled to develop its own nuclear arsenal. On October 11, 1956, a Valiant aircraft successfully released a 10,000-pound Blue Danube freefall bomb over Maralinga in Australia. The subsequent year marked a significant milestone for Britain, as it conducted its first thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb test, dropping it 400 miles off Christmas Island in the Pacific as part of the Operation Grapple tests. The third of these drops produced Britain's first megaton detonation. Britain's place at the superpower table was now assured, and America keen to rebuild a special relationship.
The aircraft was painted in a special anti-thermal flash paint. There were no black dielectric covers for the radar components on the outside. This was all, and even the flying controls, the seals on the flying controls were all made of a special anti-radiation neoprene material. The other item of equipment, which was very essential, was we had to black out the whole of the crew cabin. And so at a certain time prior to the bombing run, all the blackout screens went up, so the whole cabin was sealed. The only small slot was immediately in front of the captain on the left-hand side, which was a very heavily smoked glass screen, a matter of 3 or 4 inches by 1 inch or so, very small slot. Now, on the explosion of the weapon, we felt this in the form of 2 shock waves. The first one was the immediate air blast, and this affected our instruments in that the vertical speed indicator went to full-scale deflection, i.e. 4,000 feet a minute down, and then settled back again to 0. The second shock was the reflected ground wave several seconds later, and it did shake the aircraft, there was no doubt. It was quite a thump that we felt. By this time, we were going away from the explosion. We had our tail towards it, having completed an escape maneuver. And this escape maneuver involved turning through, I think, about 135 degrees and pulling an exact amount of G. We had a very accurate accelerometer fitted, and I believe it was something in the order of about 1.7 G. Not a lot, but at that amount of G, we could guarantee to have completed the escape maneuver. And so immediately we had completed the escape maneuver, down came the blackout screens, and there we were able to see the results of our efforts. This huge mushroom cloud way up into the stratosphere.
The initial Vulcan B-1 aircraft entered squadron service with number 83 Squadron, stationed at Waddington in July 1957. In April of the subsequent year, number 10 Squadron, based at Cottesmore, became the first operational squadron to receive the Victor B-1, thus completing the V-Force.
It was very exciting. I think that's more the word. Thinking back, I suppose we did feel that we were entering a new era in operational flying.
There was a great air of expectation and pride at being selected to fly these new bombers. One considered oneself in the elite, if you like.
It had become apparent for some time that delivering a free-fall bomb to any Soviet target would be an extremely perilous endeavor, given the rapid advancements in Soviet defense capabilities. The answer lay in standoff weapons, missiles which could fly themselves to the target after being launched from an aircraft. In March 1956, Avro was awarded the contract to build the Blue Steel. Blue Steel was 35 feet long and carried a red thermonuclear warhead that used rocket propulsion and had a range of 100 miles. A Valiant B-1 was used in the early trials, which despite some initial setbacks, would extend it to other V-bombers. By 1963, Blue Steel was ready to go into service. Nonetheless, the development of the Mark II version was already underway, promising significantly extended range. Progress on this version was slow, but it was eventually cancelled in favor of the American Douglas Skybolt, scheduled to replace the Blue Steel missile in 1965. However, it became apparent that the Victors could not carry the Skybolt missile. Consequently, Avro initiated the adaptation of 72 Vulcans for this purpose. These modified Vulcans, designated as the new Mark IIs, entered into service in December 1960. These aircraft had a more powerful engine, the operated 16,000-pound Olympus, which could push the Vulcan up to Mach 0.98. An enlarged wing which gave it an improved service ceiling of 55,000 feet, as well as a host of new electronic countermeasure equipment. But the RAF's plans went awry in November 1962, when President Kennedy canceled the Skybolt.
The problem with the Skybolt is it's the most sophisticated weapon imaginable. We put $500 million into it already. Fire a missile from a plane moving at high speed.
After extensive diplomatic and political negotiations, President Kennedy agreed to allow the British to acquire the submarine-launched Polaris missile system. The timetable for the demise of Britain's airborne nuclear deterrent was set. In the interim, Bomber Command would persist with the Blue Steel missile and freefall bombs. By 1963, NATO had established its response policy to counter the Soviet threat. The primary responsibility for strategic deterrence was entrusted to the formidable American Boeing B-52s under Strategic Air Command. They were supported by batteries of medium-range and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Europe's contribution to the nuclear deterrent rested solely with the V-Force. A tripwire policy meant that any Soviet aggression would be countered by a massive nuclear strike. This meant that the British bomber crews were always on instant readiness. Quick Reaction Alert, or QRA, was designed to disperse the aircraft to airfields around the UK. At these bases, the air crews would reside either in readiness huts adjacent to their aircraft or inside the aircraft themselves.
Life was fairly tedious. There's no getting away from that. You sat around for 24 hours or went to sleep in a caravan, waiting for the whistle to blow. But it was an opportunity to do other things. Of course, you did quite a bit of target study while you were on QRA. And that was simply sort of locking yourself away in a secure room and getting your target material out and working on that.
Essentially then, you would deploy the aircraft to wherever, set yourself up, and you'd end up with 4 aircraft on the ORP, fully fueled, weapons as required, not nuclear weapons for a dispersal, obviously. And we'd be plugged into what they called the telescramble, which, if you like, was a phone all the way back to Bomber Command. The crews would be sitting in, we had little caravans that were taken around if there was no purpose-built accommodation. And you'd sit there, and in the background, I always remember, you'd have this beep about every 10, 15 seconds, which was just to prove that the line to Bomber Command was still open. And then, at the appropriate time, which you'd always try and second guess and usually get it wrong, there'd be a message from Bomber Command, or Strike Command as it became, raising the alert state. Now, the normal alert state was called Readiness 1.5, and at Readiness 1.5, that meant you were in flying kit, you were in the vicinity of the aircraft in the caravans or having a meal, and 1.5 meant you had to be airborne within 15 minutes. They could then raise that to Readiness 0.5, which meant you had to be airborne within 5 minutes. So for that, you would go out to the aircraft, strap in, do some preliminary checks, but wouldn't start the engines, because if you start the engines, you're burning fuel, which of course limits the time. There was up to 0.2, which was airborne in 2 minutes. For that, you did start the engines. Of course, there's a finite time then of how long the Lords and Masters can hold you at that alert state, and the ultimate one of scramble. And the normal one for us was Readiness 0.5 would be called. A few minutes after we got into the aircraft, they would scramble us, and then everything worked extremely well. The aircraft was designed, one button, press that, all 4 engines start, the powered flying controls run up. Everything was designed to automatically snatch out the back. You didn't bother with unplugging anything, just opened the throttles and went. In theory, the number 1 aircraft went first, but if he was delayed, he'd be elbowed out of the way by the number 2, and you just went. And as soon as you're airborne, start to disperse in the air to get out of the way of any incoming missiles. And certainly, Readiness 1.5, no trouble at all. If you said scramble from Readiness 1.5, we'd be a bit upset if people weren't airborne within 6 or 7 minutes if they were living close to the aircraft. Maybe 10 minutes if they had to take a transport. It was good. It was practiced regularly. It worked.
Traditionally, V-bomber operations and crew training had focused on flying at high altitudes and launching missiles from there. However, in May 1960, new evidence regarding the development of Soviet missiles came to light. Then, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Gary Powers, was shot down by a surface-to-air missile shot over Soviet territory at a height of 65,000 feet. A full 10,000 feet higher than the operational ceiling of the V-bombers. This, together with the cancellation of Skybolt, effectively signaled the end of high-level operations. Over the following 3 years, procedures were overhauled to shift operations to low-level flying. Initially, flights were conducted at 1,000 feet above ground level, and eventually, when conditions permitted, they could go as low as 50 feet above the ground.
One of the beauties of the Vulcan was, of course, it was extremely responsive on the controls. handled more like a fighter. You even had a fighter stick, even though great big wheel. So the low-level operation didn't actually cause much of a problem.
Although blue steel could be launched at low level, new methods had to be advised for freefall bombs. This led to the use of the Labs maneuver, which exploited the handling characteristics of the V-Force aircraft to the full.
In the show in 1958, we demonstrated a low-level run across the runway, pulling the aircraft up into a half loop and rolling it off the top. And the excuse for doing this was, yes, it's a demonstration of a Labs maneuver. The whole maneuver was done entirely inside service limits for the aeroplane. We didn't exceed the service limits at all. We used the maximum speed that the aircraft will be cleared to service for, which was 360 knots. And in the loop, or the half loop, we pulled 2G, which was also inside the service limits. Rolling the aircraft off the top, of course, doesn't exceed anything. It's an entirely 1G maneuver. And so, okay, it just made something good to look at Farnborough for a big aeroplane to do. You could only do it if the cloud was reasonably clear, because we went into the bottom of this thing at about 500 feet and over the top at about 8,000 feet.
But there was to be a trust. Flying at low altitudes posed challenges due to the denser air and increased turbulence, which placed greater stress on the aircraft's structure. This stress would inevitably reduce the aircraft's operational lifespan, and the Valiant was the first to experience these effects. Having flown low-level operations for Strategic Air Command Force for 2 years, already the Valiants began to show alarming structural problems. In December 1964, a routine examination of one Valiant showed fatigue cracks in the main spar. A rapid checking of all the other aircraft revealed the same problem. There was no alternative but to ground the whole fleet of Valiants from early 1965.
We heard all about this, the famous incident at Gaydon, where one of the flying instructors was flying a sortie, and there was a tremendous crack, and one of the spars on the right wing, I think it was, actually broke. They were able to reduce speed, fly back to Gaydon, RAF Gaydon, near Leamington Spa, and the crack was so bad that in fact it disconnected the drive to the right, to the starboard flap. So one flap came down and the other didn't. And so the captain very quickly realized that this was, and so he rolled his flaps back in again, because obviously the aircraft was starting to roll quite badly. And they landed this aircraft. He did a magnificent job of getting it down onto the runway, flapless. When the crew stepped out, they all walked round to the right-hand side, and they saw daylight through the wing root of where the starboard wing was joined. And that's how lucky that crew were.
The grounding of the Valiants carried a touch of irony, because even before the first production of B-1s had been delivered, a specialized low-level B-2 version had been constructed. This B-2 version was ordered during a period when Bomber Command believed there was a need for a Pathfinder force. However, it was soon cancelled when it became evident that dropping nuclear bombs did not necessitate such a high degree of accuracy. Had it entered operational service, it could have potentially rendered the Mark II versions of the Vulcan and Victor redundant, following the decision to transition to low-level operations. The grounding of the Valiants and the transfer of the nuclear deterrent of the Navy at some point in the future did mean there was a need to reorganize the way in which the V-Force functioned. Admittedly, there were some cutbacks in order. The Mark II Victor, equipped with the mighty Rolls-Royce Conway engines, was the first to suffer when almost half the order was cancelled, leaving the RAF with only 34 of them.
When the Mark II came along, yes, that was absolutely superb, the amount of power we had. the original Conway 11 wasn't the definitive engine for the aircraft. The definitive engine was the Conway 17, I think I'm getting my numbers right, and it delivered 20,500 pounds of thrust. And that flew just about a year later, and subsequently they all had the big Conways in them. That really gave the aeroplane some oomph. For instance, you could sit a Mark II Victor on the end of the runway, and provided that the radar air traffic controllers would give you a clear climb out, open up the power against the brakes, and at about 85% power, the airplane was going to move anyway. It wouldn't hold it. The brakes didn't slip. It was just dragging it along the ground on the tires. So you didn't let it do that. At the moment it started to want to move, let go the brakes, hit full power, and from the moment of letting the brakes go, you could consistently have that aircraft out of 20,000 feet in 2 minutes and 8 seconds and up to 40,000 feet in 8 minutes. Now, for an aeroplane of this size, this was really performance, without a doubt.
But the V-Force would continue for 3 major reasons. Firstly, TSR-2 had been cancelled with no credible replacement in sight. It was left to the Vulcan to maintain the RAF's strike capability. Furthermore, NATO exerted pressure on the British government to retain the V-bombers as tactical strike aircraft to counter the formidable Warsaw Pact ground forces in Central Europe. Additionally, in-flight refueling techniques had been refined during the 1950s, utilizing Valiants as tankers. The ability to refuel in flight greatly extended the reach of the RAF, enabling it to give up bases in some of the more far-flung reaches of the globe. Fighter Command had also come to rely on in-flight refueling to extend the range of its frontline aircraft. When the Lightning aircraft entered into service, it had an endurance of just over 40 minutes, which made it an impractical proposition for extended operations without the capability to refuel. However, with consistent refueling from tanker aircraft, these planes could essentially fly for extended durations. Following the retirement of the Valiants, this refueling role was assumed by the Victors. Almost immediately, every available Mark I was converted. The first 6 were equipped with 2 retractable refueling hoses in pods under the wings. The next 25 had a third hose, fitted into the bomb bay. By the end of 1966, 3 squadrons were fully operational as tankers. In 1968, the Victor was withdrawn from the bomber force altogether, because of the impending delivery of the Polaris to the Royal Navy, and because of the uncertain future of Handley Page aircraft. Ironically, the contract to convert the remaining B-2s to K-2 tankers was awarded to Avro. The extensive reach of the V-Force was vividly showcased during the Falklands War in 1982, when Vulcans, refueled by Victors, undertook the longest bombing mission in history.
Part of the deal of the Vulcan is a threat. And we'd made it clear that we could. We physically had the ability to bomb the Argentinian mainland. So the Argentinian Air Force had to reserve a fair proportion of its fighters to defend the homeland. This means that when they put their A4s in against the fleet, they essentially were going in unescorted. And the aircraft that could have been there and interfering with the operations and taking out the Harriers were being held back to defend the mainland. Again, one of the contributions that the Vulcan made.
By that time, the Vulcan was already being phased out and replaced by the Tornado GR-1. Additionally, the RAF had Buccaneers at its disposal, capable of conducting low-level bombing missions equipped with cutting-edge weapon guidance technology. But neither aircraft could carry sufficient payload that distance. Preparing the Vulcans had to be carried out in record time.
We trained at 43,000 feet and 500 feet, and it was such an unusual thing that when they were looking for statistical figures to work out bomb dropping, they actually had to go back to the B-29 missions over North Korea during the Korean War. That was the last time medium-level bombing had been done. We didn't have tables for those kind of... A lot of things had to be dug up. And in fact, the Vulcans, of course, were going out of service. As we were bombing over the Falklands, they were breaking up Vulcans at Waddington. And a lot of the equipment that we were carrying down with us had actually been rescued from the scrap heap. There were people who had never done £1,000 bombing in their lives before. And again, we had to find one of the very, very experienced nav radars who was briefing people on kit that, of course, had been his life in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But he never thought he was going to be trotting this information out in the 80s. Never throw anything away. You never know when you might need it.
A total of 11 Victor tankers were required for each mission, with each Vulcan bomber being refueled 5 times on the outbound journey and once on the return trip. The Victors themselves needed to be refueled 10 times to support this operation. The pilot for the second sortie was Squadron Leader John Reeve, who recounted,
There was very little radar activity, quite frankly, over the islands. We cast off at about 250 miles north of the islands and dropped down to low level. And again, no one was for one moment doubting that the Argentinians were a fairly professional force. I mean, their pilots are as good as anyone, no suggestion there. But what we felt was, if you're going to intercept an aircraft at night, an awful lot of things have got to go right. And they've got to go right on a very technical level. And while I had no doubt about the Argentinian pilots, we were not convinced that the Argentinian conscript technicians could necessarily do the little technical things, make sure the generator's at exactly the right frequency so the radar picture is perfect, that the radar is correctly set up. And certainly when we went in very low level to avoid the radar. We then climbed up to about 14,000 feet and bombed from that height, which was above the effective range of their light anti-aircraft guns. It also had the advantage that the bombs, when dropped, would strike the runway nearly vertically, so there was no possibility of them bouncing off. They would penetrate well through and blow up in the subsoil and really heave the runway up. So we were not picked up by the radar, and to some extent I'm not surprised in that to operate a radar on the Falklands 24 hours a day in those conditions is not easy. I'm not sure the very finest Argentinian troops were put ashore, and we felt by day I'd have been very, very wary of going. But by night, when everything's got to be a technical thing, we felt we were in with a reasonable chance.
However, this mission marked the final significant operational use of the Vulcan, and in 1984, these aircraft were retired from active service. Then, in 1992, it too made its last appearance. The Victor was the last of the V-Force to leave RAF service. Serving well into the 1990s, the Victor aircraft played a crucial role in the Gulf War, providing invaluable refueling support not only to RAF aircraft, but also to those of numerous coalition partners. Alongside 10 VC-10s and TriStars, the 7 Victors took their share of 299 sorties in just 42 days, helping to deliver 13,000 tons of fuel to the first strike aircraft. For 38 years, the skies of Britain shuddered under the noise of these great 4-jet engine bombers. As conventional bombers, nuclear carriers, and tankers, they performed their tasks with style and grace. Indeed, these aircraft, designed to fulfill the demands of the Cold War era, stand as a testament to the pinnacle of aviation design. The question of whether the airborne nuclear deterrent was justified remains as a matter of debate, but history does suggest its significance. It has not only served as a crucial component of Britain's defense strategy, but also provided a compelling reason for the United States to maintain a close relationship with Britain, ultimately contributing to the safety and security of Western Europe for 4 decades. As to the cost, one should heed the words of Sir Frederick Henry Page when he said, "Nobody has ever won a war by trying to run it on the cheap. Nothing is so expensive as losing them. By saving money, if you want the cheapest possible air force today, it is very easy to standardize on a whole lot of aircraft which will be of no use when a war comes."